You've just caught me completing the end of my weekly shop, and what we're going to be doing in this month's video is we're going to be looking at packaging and dispelling some of the myths about packaging. So let's see what I've typically picked up in this week's shopping. Right, that's the easy bit out of the way. Now for the difficult bit, the unpacking. So what have we got then? Well, we've got some bananas, and these bananas have come in a plastic bag. Research demonstrates that if you wrap bananas up, their shelf life is substantially increased than bananas which aren't wrapped. But of course, that's not just related to bananas. The record breaker in that department is the cucumber, where a cucumber would last for around about 3 days without any packaging on it. And by covering it in this very, very thin plastic film, it increases the lifespan of a cucumber from 3 days up to about 14 days. And if that means that the entire cucumber is actually eaten, then the environmental impacts associated from the saving of waste food are substantially better than the impact associated with that small piece of plastic. We've also got some food cans, and food cans, of course, have gone through a process which most packaging materials have gone through over the last few years, which is lightweighting. And certainly over the last 50 years, the amount of steel that's used in food cans has gone down dramatically, well, about 39% overall. And finally in here we've got a bottle of milk. And milk bottles over the last few years have increased the amount of recycled content they've got, but recently Nampak Plastics, who manufacture this bottle, have started to introduce a new type of bottle, which is a lightweight bottle called Infini. Infini is around about 11 to 21% lighter in terms of the plastic material that's used in its overall construction. So again, a substantial improvement. And of course, the bottle that's left behind once you've used the product is, of course, recyclable. Now, one of the biggest impacts associated with packaging material is people criticise it for the amount of energy that's actually used. But actually, when you look at the energy use associated with foodstuffs, then the picture is slightly different. So, for example, about 50% of the energy associated with a food product is associated with the manufacture of the product itself. Then around about 10% of the energy impact is associated with all packaging material for the product. And about 10% is associated with transporting that product from the factories or the farm through to the supermarkets for the consumers to actually use it. And that leaves this remaining 30% of energy used associated with foodstuffs, and that's the consumer's behaviour themselves. It's actually driving to the supermarket, bringing it home and actually cooking it. And more importantly, actually keeping it cool. Actually, the consumer's biggest environmental impact in terms of foodstuff is associated with keeping it cold in the fridge or using freezers. And that's the same for supermarkets as well, because actually one of the biggest impacts associated with food in the supermarket is actually refrigeration, which brings me on to another point. Lots of people think that it could be this is the biggest impact associated with supermarkets, the humble plastic bag. And like all sorts of packaging materials over the last few years, these have got substantially lighter, and these particular bags have got 50% recycled content in them. All a good, solid environmental story. But the environmental impact associated with the plastic bag is far less overall than, say, that associated with refrigeration. The problem with plastic bags is they're very visual, like all packaging. And people see them as a nuisance, and particularly with some emotive images, with plastic bags being caught up with wildlife, that has made consumers focus very hard on what they're doing about this and not thinking very hard about their real environmental impacts. A consumer simply turning down their home heating by, say, 2 degrees a year, or a consumer actually reducing the amount of times they use the car by just 1/4 of a mile per day would save more carbon than all of the packaging material that the average consumer buys in a year. That very small change would have a dramatic impact. And that's the sort of message we've got to try and get across to the consumer. We have to look at all the environmental arguments, not just simple environmental issues or nuisance issues. So what we thought we'd do now is take a step back and move back up the supply chain to go and have a look at one of the UK's premier packaging sites. So we've come here to Euro Packaging, south of Birmingham, in the West Midlands, to have a look at a modern-day packaging industry. And one can't help but be impressed at the sheer scale and sophistication of what goes on in this company. So it's hardly surprising that they're one of the fastest-growing packaging businesses in Britain. But we mustn't lose sight of an important fact, and that is that what this company is doing is not simply supplying packaging per se. It is helping to satisfy the insatiable demand of consumers who wish to be able to buy billions of products every single day and receive them in pristine condition. And without packaging like this, that would not happen. So like a scene from a modern day version of Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, over my right shoulder I have more than 26,000 pallets of more than 1,600 different varieties of packaging material. Welcome to the packaging industry in the 21st century. So here's another load of essential packaging material about to leave this warehouse in the West Midlands. And it really begs the question, if this material is so essential to the supply chain for consumer goods, why does packaging have such a bad reputation? Is it really all the fault of the media? So we wanted to get the view of a journalist, and who better to talk to than Josh Brooks from Packaging News. Josh, why do you think the packaging industry has such a negative reputation?
I think there are a couple of things at play, and I would question to an extent the idea that packaging has a wholly negative reputation. Certainly national newspapers and journalists generally, myself included, have a tendency to play to the prejudices to an extent of their audience. Mm-hmm. Now, consumers generally are more likely to think about packaging in terms of what they do with it when they throw it away and they've got their food or their product out of it. That's the point where it becomes an issue and, to an extent, a problem. And newspapers, whenever there is a scare story about recycling or whatever it might be, are very happy to seize on that and to feed that prejudice. Mm-hmm. That's what all newspapers do. That's how they sell. Mm-hmm. The second point I would make is that I think I've worked in two other industries as a journalist. I've worked in the printing industry and I've worked in the building construction industry. And both of those industries also think that they're picked on all the time, whether it's because young people aren't coming into it or because in the building industry, for instance, a project goes wrong, Wembley Stadium is late and over budget. They get picked on for that as well. Mm. And the industry will seize on that and say, we're the whipping boy of the national newspapers. They're not necessarily. The national newspapers are pretty aggressive with everybody.
So Josh, if I can ask you, what do you think the industry could do to try and change the negative perception it has?
I think there are lots of interesting initiatives going on at the moment. Clearly, in the political sphere, there are the people like the Packaging Federation and InkPen, the various material-specific sector bodies who all do a great job in lobbying government on policy. In terms of the public, it's a different question. And I think what the packaging industry per se, if we're talking about packaging manufacturing, I think what that industry can do is relatively limited. Mm-hmm. However, the people in the supply chain who do have a very public face are the big brands, the supermarkets, and so on. And I think the onus is really on them to say, look, packaging's not a problem. Mm-hmm. Now, there is something of a tendency among that group of people as well to focus on the recyclability of their packaging, on basically what you do with it when you throw it away. And they're well within their rights to do that. It's absolutely right to promote that sort of thing. But it does reinforce this idea that packaging is a problem.
Yeah.
However, I think there's also a lot of good work that comes out of the supermarkets. I remember Justin King a few months ago on Newsnight defending the life out of packaging and saying how brilliant it is. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a bit of a distinction to be made between the idea of packaging as a concept and this being an attack on the packaging
Yeah.
manufacturing industry per se.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Josh. This probably would have been a typical scene outside a British household around about 10 to 15 years ago, when Britain languished at the bottom of the European league table for recycling. And that's changed quite dramatically with the introduction of lots of different recycling programmes across the UK, and Britain has crawled its way back up to be around about 8th and 9th in Europe in terms of recycling. So here we see the typical scene that we would have outside a household. This is West Oxfordshire that we're in today. And they run an alternatively weekly collection scheme when this week, obviously, it's green bin week and there isn't a black bin out here at all. There's a little food waste caddy down there for all of the organic food waste materials, but the bit we're interested in is what goes in here, the recycling bins. And typically in here there are some newspapers in here. We've got some plastic bottles of different types, including HDPE milk bottles. So these are currently being made with about 10% recycled content. That's going to be rising to 30 to 50% over the next few years. And this is a high value recyclable material. We've also got some metal packaging, some steel and some aluminium. And these materials, if recovered and recycled, save a huge amount of energy in terms of making virgin metals. So we've also got some other plastics and also a bit of glass in here as well. Now, of course, that's the key point. What we have to do is to try and persuade members of the public to stop seeing these materials as rubbish. It's not rubbish. These are valuable resources which they are participating in the recovery of through schemes like this. And that's a really important point, because what every man, woman and child who recycles is doing is they are not only saving vast amounts of resources, they're saving an awful lot of carbon and energy that's used for the manufacture of virgin material. That's a tremendous environmental benefit that everybody can participate in. Now, that's a good story. That's a story worth telling.